The morning sun peeked through the large windows of Riverside Diner, casting warm shadows across the checkered floor tiles. For James, this sight had become as familiar as his own reflection. At 32, he had spent the last 5 years working at this cozy corner establishment, his hands expertly balancing plates while his mind wandered to dreams of his own restaurant. The diner wasn't fancy, just your typical small-town eatery with its faded blue booths, slightly squeaky ceiling fans, and the ever-present aroma of fresh coffee mingling with bacon. But there was something special about this place, something that kept both locals and travelers coming back. Maybe it was the way the morning light made everything look a bit softer, or perhaps it was the genuine warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. James had his routine down to a science. Every morning, he'd arrive 30 minutes early, prepare the coffee machines, wipe down the tables until they gleamed, and make sure each sugar dispenser was filled to the perfect level. He took pride in these small details, treating the diner as if it were already the restaurant he dreamed of owning someday. The regulars loved him, not just for his efficiency or the way he remembered their usual orders, but for his genuine interest in their lives. He knew which customers needed their coffee the moment they walked in, which ones enjoyed a friendly chat, and which preferred their space with their morning paper. But Tuesdays and Thursdays were special. Those were the days when Mrs. Ann would visit. She'd been coming to the diner for the past 3 years, always arriving at precisely 9:30 a.m., maneuvering her wheelchair with practiced ease through the narrow spaces between tables. James had noticed her struggling that first day, the way other customers awkwardly avoided eye contact, how some servers seemed unsure how to approach her. Without hesitation, he had stepped forward, greeting her with the same warm smile he offered everyone. "Good morning. Would you prefer the corner table? It has the best view of the garden outside, and there's more space for you to be comfortable." The genuine relief in her eyes that day had touched something in his heart. From then on, James made sure her favorite corner spot was always ready by 9:25 a.m. He'd adjust the chair settings just right, ensure the table height was perfect, and have a fresh glass of water with exactly 3 lemon slices waiting, the way she liked it. Some of his coworkers teased him about paying such attention to detail, but James understood that sometimes the smallest gestures could make someone feel truly seen. Working double shifts wasn't easy. His feet would ache, and some days the weight of his dreams felt heavier than the trays he carried. Each morning, he'd check his savings app, watching the numbers slowly climb toward his goal of owning his own place. Between helping his mother with her medications and trying to save for cooking school, progress was slower than he hoped. But James wasn't one to complain. His mother had taught him that good things come to those who work hard and keep faith. The diner's bell would chime throughout the day, bringing in all sorts of people: tired truckers seeking strong coffee, business folks rushing through their lunches, families with young children making a mess with their pancakes. James handled them all with the same patient smile and attentive service. He believed every person who walked through those doors deserved to feel welcome, just as he hoped future customers would feel in his own restaurant someday. Little did James know that his simple acts of kindness, especially toward Mrs. Ann, were about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. But for now, he was content making sure the coffee was hot, the service was excellent, and everyone who entered Riverside Diner felt like they belonged. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, something beautiful began to grow between James and Mrs. Ann. It wasn't just about serving coffee and pancakes anymore. It was about those precious moments of connection that made life richer and more meaningful. One quiet morning, while James was refilling her coffee cup, Mrs. Ann's hands trembled more than usual. Instead of trying to hide it or feeling embarrassed, she looked up at him with a gentle smile and started sharing stories from her past. Her fingers, now shaking with multiple sclerosis, had once danced across piano keys, bringing classical music to life in concert halls across the country. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee slowly, "I taught piano for over 30 years. Had students from all walks of life. Music has a way of bringing people together that nothing else quite matches. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke about her former students, some who went on to become professional musicians themselves. James found himself pulled into her stories, amazed by the strength hidden beneath her gentle exterior. During slower periods at the diner, he'd pull up a chair for a few minutes, soaking in tales of her performances in grand concert halls, the challenges she faced as a female musician in the 1970s, and how she never let anything stop her from pursuing her passion. The other regular customers began to notice their special bond. Old Mr. Johnson, who always sat at the counter with his morning paper, would smile knowingly when he saw James carefully helping Mrs. Ann cut her pancakes on days when her hands weren't cooperating. The morning rush crowd grew used to seeing the corner table reserved for a special guest sign that James had handmade. Sometimes, Mrs. Ann would notice things about James that others missed, like how his smile would fade slightly when he thought no one was looking, or how he'd massage his shoulder after carrying heavy trays for hours. She never pushed him to talk, but her presence offered a silent comfort that made those challenging days a little easier. One morning, while helping her with her coat, James mentioned his dream of opening his own restaurant. His eyes lit up as he described the warm, welcoming place he envisioned. A spot where everyone would feel at home, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Mrs. Ann listened intently, nodding at all the right moments, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like pride. "You know what makes a great teacher?" she asked him unexpectedly. When James shook his head, she continued, "The ability to see potential in others and help them believe in themselves. You have that gift, just like I did with my students. Only your instrument isn't a piano. It's the way you make people feel welcome and valued." Their conversations weren't always deep. Sometimes they'd just share simple jokes or talk about the weather. Mrs. Ann would tease him about his endless coffee refills, and he'd playfully scold her for trying to sneak extra butter for her toast. These small moments of laughter and friendship became the highlights of their days. Other servers began coming to James for advice on handling different situations with customers. They saw how naturally he navigated challenging moments, whether it was calming down an upset customer or making someone with special needs feel comfortable. Without realizing it, he was already becoming the kind of leader he hoped to be in his own restaurant someday. What touched James the most was how Mrs. Ann never treated him with pity when he shared his struggles, and he returned that same respect when helping her with things she found difficult. They had both faced their share of prejudices and obstacles in life, and perhaps that's what made their friendship so genuine. The understanding that true dignity comes from seeing people for who they are, not what they can or cannot do. Neither of them knew it yet, but their simple acts of kindness and mutual respect were building towards something extraordinary. For now, they were just grateful for their twice-weekly meetings in that sunny corner of the diner, where two unlikely friends found understanding in a world that often overlooked such connections. Behind every smile, there's often a story untold. While James maintained his cheerful demeanor at the diner, serving plates with warmth and greeting customers with genuine kindness, life was becoming increasingly challenging behind the scenes. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier with each passing day, though you'd never guess it from his gentle smile and patient manner. Late one night, after a particularly long double shift, James sat at his small kitchen table, sorting through a pile of bills. His mother's medical expenses had nearly doubled in the past few months. The arthritis in her hands had worsened, requiring more specialized treatment that their insurance barely covered. Each time he looked at the growing stack of medical bills, his dream of attending cooking school seemed to slip a little further away. The small jar on his windowsill, labeled Restaurant Fund in his neat handwriting, hadn't seen a new edition in weeks. He'd been diligently saving for 3 years, watching the contents grow penny by penny, but lately every spare dollar went to his mother's care. Some nights, he'd sit and stare at that jar, remembering his father's words before he passed. "Dreams don't have deadlines, son. They just need you to keep believing." At work, Mrs. Ann began to notice subtle changes in James's demeanor. His smile, though still present, didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The spring in his step had softened, and sometimes she caught him lost in thought while refilling the salt shakers. Being a mother herself, she recognized the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. One particularly busy morning, James accidentally dropped a stack of plates in the kitchen. The crash brought the usual breakfast chaos to a sudden halt. As he knelt to clean up the mess, his hands trembling slightly, the weight of everything seemed to press down on him at once. The medical bills, the delayed dreams, the constant worry about his mother, it all felt overwhelming. Mrs. Ann watched from her corner table as he emerged from the kitchen, his composure restored, but his eyes betraying his exhaustion. When he came to check on her coffee, she gently asked, "How's your mother doing?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly broke through his carefully maintained facade. He paused for a moment, then shared how his mother had taught him everything he knew about cooking. How she'd stand him on a chair when he was little so he could watch her season the Sunday roast. How she'd quiz him about spices while they did the dishes together. "She's the reason I want to open a restaurant," he admitted quietly. "She always believed in my dream, even when nobody else did." The other regulars at the diner had noticed James's situation too. Old Mr. Johnson would leave slightly larger tips when he could, and the morning rush crowds seemed more patient, more understanding. The diner had become more than just a workplace. It was a community that cared about its own. Despite the mounting pressures, James refused to let his circumstances dim his spirit of service. He still made sure Mrs. Ann's corner table was perfect each Tuesday and Thursday. He still remembered how everyone liked their eggs, which customers needed extra napkins, and who preferred their toast barely toasted. These small acts of attention helped him stay focused on his goals, even when they seemed distant. One evening, after helping his mother into bed, James found an old photo album. Inside were pictures of his parents' small catering business they'd run from their kitchen when he was young, before illness and hard times had forced them to stop. Looking at those faded photographs, he felt a renewed determination. His dream wasn't just about him anymore. It was about continuing a family legacy of bringing people together through food. What James didn't know was that his daily demonstrations of perseverance and kindness, especially during these difficult times, had touched more hearts than he realized. Sometimes, the universe has a way of recognizing genuine goodness, and wheels were already in motion that would change his life forever. But for now, he continued to serve each customer with care, hold on to his dreams, and trust that somehow, someday, everything would work out. The afternoon sun streamed through the diner windows, creating long shadows across the checkered floor. It was during these quieter moments, between the lunch rush and dinner service, that Mrs. Ann and James shared their deepest conversations. Today was different, though. There was a heaviness in the air, a readiness to speak about things usually left unsaid. "You know," Mrs. Ann began, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "back in 1975, I was the only female pianist in my orchestra." Her voice carried the weight of old memories. "The conductor wouldn't look me in the eye for the first 3 months. Some said I only got the position because they needed to look progressive." She smiled wryly, her hand steady for a moment as she gripped her cup. James pulled up a chair, sensing this was a story that needed to be heard. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars reading their papers at the counter. "How did you handle it?" he asked, genuinely curious about her journey. "I practiced twice as hard as everyone else," she replied, her eyes distant with remembrance. "Arrived earlier, stayed later. But you know what really changed things? The music itself. When I played, they couldn't deny my talent anymore. The piano doesn't care who's pressing the keys. It only cares about the heart behind the music." James nodded, understanding flowing between them. He shared his own story about trying to secure a small business loan for his restaurant dream. 4 different banks, he said quietly. Each time, they had a different reason. Too risky. Not enough experience. The area's not right." He paused, arranging sugar packets absently. But each time, I could see it in their eyes. They'd made up their minds before I even sat down. Mrs. Ann reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she patted his arm. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. "People look at us and see what they expect to see. But just like I had my music, you have your cooking, your service, the way you treat people. That's your symphony." They talked about how times had changed, yet in some ways stayed the same. Mrs. Ann described performances where audience members would leave when they saw who was playing, only to sheepishly return weeks later after hearing about her talent. James shared stories of customers who'd request a different server, only to become his regulars after experiencing his service. The hardest part, Mrs. Ann confided, wasn't the obvious discrimination. It was the subtle things. The surprise in people's voices when they realized I could play well. The backhanded compliments. The way some would talk slower to me now that I'm in this wheelchair, as if it affected my mind instead of my legs. James understood perfectly. He told her about the surprise on people's faces when he demonstrated his knowledge of wine pairings, or when he spoke about his plans for a fusion restaurant combining different culinary traditions. "It's like they can't imagine that I've spent years studying this, planning for it," he said. But their conversation wasn't just about the challenges. They shared laughs about the small victories too. Mrs. Ann described the standing ovation after her first solo performance and how the same conductor who wouldn't look at her became one of her strongest supporters. James talked about the regular customers who'd started asking his advice about their own business ventures. "You know what I've learned?" Mrs. Ann said, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes the biggest statement you can make is just showing up, doing what you love, and doing it well. Success is the sweetest revenge." James grinned, refilling her teacup. "And sometimes the people who doubt you end up being your biggest cheerleaders," he added, thinking of the bank manager who'd initially turned him down, but now came in for coffee every morning. Their shared understanding went beyond words. It was about recognizing the same spirit in each other, the determination to be seen for their abilities rather than their limitations or appearances. In that quiet afternoon at the diner, two souls from different generations found common ground in their experiences, their struggles, and their unwavering hope for a better tomorrow. What they didn't realize was how their friendship was about to prove that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales, rewarding perseverance and kindness when least expected. Sometimes life has a way of testing your strength just when you think you can't take any more. For James, that test came on a rainy Tuesday morning when he received the 5th rejection letter from the bank. He sat in his car outside the diner, the letter crumpled in his hands, rain tapping against the windshield like it was trying to comfort him. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred together as he read them again. 5 years of saving every spare penny. Countless hours spent perfecting his business plan. Detailed spreadsheets showing exactly how he'd make the restaurant profitable. None of it seemed to matter. The rejection felt heavier than all the plates he'd ever carried. Inside the diner, everything went on as usual. The coffee maker hummed its familiar tune, toast popped up golden brown, and regular customers chatted over their breakfast. But James's heart wasn't in it today. His smile felt forced, and his usual spring in his step was missing. The other servers noticed, quietly picking up extra tables to help him through the morning. At 9:30, he glanced at the corner table. Mrs. Ann's spot. But for the first time in 3 years, the table remained empty. He told himself she was probably just running late. By 10 o'clock, he started to worry. Mrs. Ann was never late. At 10:30, he called Betty, the other regular who sometimes gave Mrs. Ann rides to the diner. "Haven't heard from her in a few days," Betty said, concern evident in her voice. "That's not like her at all." The next Thursday came, and still no Mrs. Ann. The corner table stood empty like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. James kept her favorite tea blend warm, just in case. He'd grown used to their talks, the way she'd listen without judgment, how she'd share her own stories of overcoming obstacles. Her absence left a hole in his day that felt bigger than he expected. A week turned into 2. Regular customers kept asking about her, and each time James had to shake his head, his worry growing. He'd never realized how much he'd come to depend on their twice-weekly conversations until they stopped. The diner felt different without her presence, like a song missing its melody. Old Mr. Johnson, who'd been coming to the diner for 20 years, noticed James's distraction. "Son," he said one morning, pushing his empty coffee cup forward, "sometimes life takes away the very thing we need most right when we need it. But that doesn't mean the story's over." James tried to keep his spirits up, but the combination of the bank rejection and Mrs. Ann's unexplained absence weighed heavily on him. His mother noticed his subdued mood when he visited after his shifts. "Baby," she said, her arthritic hands gentle on his cheek, "you've got your father's determination and my heart. Whatever's troubling you, you'll get through it." The days blurred together. James went through the motions, taking orders, serving food, making small talk with customers. But his mind kept wandering to Mrs. Ann. Was she okay? Had her health taken a turn for the worse? The not knowing was the hardest part. He started leaving little notes on her corner table. "Missing our talks. Hope you're well. Tea's ready when you are." Other regulars saw the notes and added their own messages. Soon, the corner table became a small shrine of well wishes and concern. One particularly rough morning, after another sleepless night worried about both his future and Mrs. Ann, James found himself sorting silverware with tears in his eyes. The rejection letter from the bank sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder of dreams deferred. The empty corner table seemed to mock him, as if saying that some things in life just weren't meant to be. But just as the weight of everything felt unbearable, the diner's bell chimed. James looked up, and his heart stopped. There, in the doorway, was a familiar wheelchair. But something was different. Mrs. Ann looked smaller somehow, frailer. Yet her eyes, when they met his, held the same determined spark he remembered. What James didn't know was that this moment marked not an ending, but a beginning. Sometimes life's biggest blessings come disguised as its greatest disappointments. And sometimes, just when you think your dreams are slipping away, life has a way of surprising you with something even better than you imagined. The moment Mrs. Ann wheeled through the diner's door, the whole atmosphere changed. Regular customers straightened in their seats, whispers of relief spreading through the morning crowd. James felt his heart jump as he rushed to hold the door, noticing how her hands trembled more than before, how her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "Your table's been waiting for you," he said softly, fighting back the emotion in his voice. As he helped guide her wheelchair to the familiar corner spot, he couldn't help but notice the changes. Her once vibrant silver hair had thinned, and her face looked tired, but her eyes, those kind eyes, still sparkled with the same warmth he remembered. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the collection of notes that had gathered on her table over the weeks. "I've been away for a while." Her voice was quieter than before, but carried a sense of purpose that James recognized from their many conversations. The regular morning crowd tried not to stare, but the relief was palpable. Old Mr. Johnson pretended to read his newspaper while stealing glances. Betty, who usually sat at the counter, moved closer to their corner, as if drawn by an invisible force. Even the young couple, who had recently started coming for breakfast, paused their conversation to watch. James brought her usual tea without being asked. Chamomile with a touch of honey, served in the blue china cup she preferred. His hands shook slightly as he set it down, remembering all the mornings this simple ritual had been missing. "We've missed you," he said simply, meaning every word. For the first time since he'd known her, Mrs. Ann stayed well past her usual hour. She sipped her tea slowly, occasionally pausing to catch her breath. James noticed how she kept checking the clock, as if waiting for something. The lunch crowd began filtering in, but she showed no signs of leaving. Around 2 o'clock, When the diner had quieted to its afternoon lull, Mrs. Ann asked James to sit with her. Her hands moved carefully as she reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook. James watched as she wrote, her handwriting less steady than before but determined, each word carefully considered. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across their corner table as Mrs. Ann continued writing. Occasionally, she would look up at James, who busied himself with small tasks nearby, not wanting to stray too far. He noticed how she would sometimes pause, close her eyes as if gathering strength, then continue writing with renewed purpose. Other servers covered his tables without being asked, understanding that something important was happening in that quiet corner. The diner's usual sounds, clinking plates, coffee brewing, casual chatter, created a gentle background to this moment that felt suspended in time. Mrs. Ann's persistence in staying until closing time surprised everyone who knew her regular habits. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the windows, she finally set down her pen. Her face showed exhaustion, but also peace, like someone who had completed an important task. James, she called softly, her voice carrying across the nearly empty diner. When he came to her table, she was folding the papers she'd spent hours writing, carefully placing them in an envelope. Her hands trembled as she sealed it, but her movements were deliberate, meaningful. The envelope she held out to him seemed to carry more weight than paper should. "Promise me something," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him catch his breath. "Don't open this until I've left. And James, thank you for everything." There was something final in her voice that made James's heart skip a beat. He wanted to ask questions, to understand why she had been gone, why this felt like more than just another visit. But years of respecting her dignity held his tongue. Instead, he helped her with her coat, just as he had done hundreds of times before. As she wheeled toward the door, she paused, looking back at the corner table that had been her spot for so long. The setting sun caught her face, and for a moment, James saw again the strong piano teacher she had once been. Then she smiled, a smile that seemed to hold a secret, and wheeled out into the evening. James stood at the door, watching until she disappeared around the corner, the envelope heavy in his pocket. Something told him this wasn't just another day at the diner. Change was coming, carried in the words sealed within that envelope, words that would reshape not just his future, but the very story of his life. The diner felt unusually quiet after the last customer left. James stood alone in the dimming light, the envelope from Mrs. Ann burning a hole in his pocket. His fingers traced its edges as he finished his closing duties, his mind racing with possibilities. The weight of the day, of the past few weeks, settled around him like a heavy blanket. Finally, after wiping the last table and turning off the main lights, he sat down in Mrs. Ann's corner spot. The chair still held the warmth from where she'd sat for hours. With trembling hands, he carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the paper that she had so carefully sealed. Inside, he found several pages covered in Mrs. Ann's distinctive handwriting. Though the letters wavered more than they used to, her words were clear and purposeful. As he began to read, his heart started beating faster. "My dearest James, by the time you read this, I will be heading back to the hospital. The doctors tell me I don't have much time left, but I've learned that time isn't what matters most in life. It's what we do with the time we have. For 3 years, I've watched you serve not just food, but dignity and kindness to everyone who walks through these doors. You've shown me what true grace looks like. When my hands shook too much to cut my food, you did it without making me feel helpless. When others saw a woman in a wheelchair, you saw a former concert pianist with stories to tell. Life hasn't been fair to you. I've watched you struggle to hold onto your dreams while taking care of your mother, working double shifts, and facing rejection after rejection from people who couldn't see past their own prejudices to recognize your worth. But you never let the unfairness of life steal your kindness. That's rare, James. Rarer than any talent I possessed at the piano. I've lived a full life. I taught hundreds of students, performed in concert halls, and traveled the world. But I never had children of my own. The money I've saved over my lifetime. My entire estate of $250,000. Has no better place to go than to someone who has shown me that humanity still exists in this world. Tomorrow morning, check your bank account. I've arranged for everything to be transferred. Don't protest. I've already made all the legal arrangements. This is my choice, my gift to someone who gave me so much more than just good service. Build your restaurant, James. Create a place where everyone feels the same dignity and respect you showed me. Let it be a place where people don't just come to eat, but to be reminded of the goodness that still exists in the world. I know you'll face challenges. People might question how you got the money or whether you deserve it. Hold your head high. You've earned this not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness performed day after day, when you thought nobody was watching. Remember me not with sadness, but by continuing to show others the same respect and dignity you showed me. That corner table where we shared so many conversations. I hope you'll keep a small space in your restaurant that reminds you of it, a place where someone else might find the kindness they need. The world needs more people like you, James. More people who see beyond appearances, who treat others with genuine respect, who hold on to their dreams even when life makes it hard. Use this gift to create something beautiful, something that will touch lives the way you touched mine. And James, thank you for the perfectly prepared tea, for the gentle assistance when my hands wouldn't cooperate, for listening to an old woman's stories. But most of all, thank you for showing me that goodness still exists in this world. With love and gratitude, Anne. James read the letter 3 times, tears falling freely onto the paper. The diner was completely silent now, but in that silence, he could hear the echo of all their conversations, all the laughs they'd shared, all the moments of understanding that had passed between them. He carefully folded the letter and held it to his chest, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Mrs. Ann's gift. Not just the money, but the belief she had in him, the recognition of his worth that he'd sought for so long. In the darkness of the empty diner, a dream that had seemed impossible just hours ago suddenly felt within reach. What Mrs. Ann had given him was more than just financial freedom. It was validation, encouragement, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest changes in life. The next morning felt like walking in a dream. James checked his bank account on his phone while sitting in his car outside the diner, his hands shaking so much he had to type in his password twice. When the numbers appeared on the screen, he had to pull over and park, overwhelmed by the reality of what Mrs. Ann had done. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Word spread quickly through the diner about Mrs. Ann's incredible gift. Regular customers who'd witnessed their friendship over the years shared in James's joy, many of them wiping away tears as they heard the story. Old Mr. Johnson actually hugged him, newspaper forgotten on the counter. "I want to do this right," James told his mother one evening, spreading out his revised business plans on their small kitchen table. She sat beside him, her arthritic hands gently touching the papers, her eyes bright with pride. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about carrying forward everything Mrs. Ann believed in." He started visiting different locations for his restaurant, this time walking in with his head held high. The same real estate agents who had once given him quick dismissals now listened attentively to his plans. He chose a spot just 3 blocks from the diner, a beautiful old building with large windows and warm brick walls. The renovation process became a community effort. Betty's son, a local contractor, offered to help with the construction at a discounted rate. Mr. Johnson's daughter, who worked in graphic design, volunteered to create the restaurant's logo. Even the diner's cook shared his supplier contacts, helping James set up relationships with the best local food vendors. As the space transformed, James made sure every detail honored Mrs. Ann's memory and values. The entrance was designed to be completely wheelchair accessible, with wide aisles and comfortable seating for everyone. In the corner, He created a special space reminiscent of Mrs. Ann's favorite spot at the diner, complete with a small plaque that read, "Where kindness meets dignity." He hired his staff carefully, looking not just for experience, but for people who understood his vision. During interviews, he shared Mrs. Ann's story, watching how candidates responded. Those who showed genuine empathy and understanding were the ones he wanted on his team. "We're not just serving food," he told his new staff during training. "We're serving respect, dignity, and kindness. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves to feel special." He taught them about accommodating different needs, about paying attention to the small details that could make someone's day better. The menu was a reflection of everything he'd learned and dreamed of over the years. He included his mother's secret recipes, dishes inspired by regular customers at the diner, and new creations that showcased his creativity. But what made him most proud was the collection of tea blends he named Anne's Corner, featuring her favorite chamomile blend. One wall of the restaurant became a tribute to connection and community. He hung photos of the old diner, of the regulars who had supported him, and in the center, a beautiful black and white photograph he'd found of Mrs. Ann at her piano, young and vibrant, her fingers flying over the keys. The night before the grand opening, James stood alone in his completed restaurant. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting gentle shadows across the polished floors and warm wooden tables. Everything was ready, the kitchen equipped, the staff trained, the menu perfected. He walked to Mrs. Ann's corner, running his hand along the smooth surface of the table there. Above it hung a small framed piece of sheet music, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, her favorite piece. As he stood there, he could almost hear her voice. "Dreams don't have deadlines, they just need you to keep believing." Tears rolled down his cheeks, but these were different from all the tears of frustration and disappointment he shed before. These were tears of gratitude, of joy, of knowing that sometimes life's greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places. Tomorrow, he would open his doors to the world. But tonight, in the quiet of his dream made real, he whispered a thank you to the woman who had seen his worth and given him not just the means to achieve his dreams, but the confidence to know he deserved them. 1 year after opening, Anne's Kitchen had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope and community in the neighborhood. The warm brick building with its welcoming entrance stood as a testament to what kindness and belief in others could achieve. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, catching the silver lettering above the door. Inside, the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with coffee and herbs. James stood at the entrance, straightening his chef's coat, watching his staff prepare for another day. The restaurant hummed with the kind of energy that comes from people who love what they do. What made Anne's Kitchen special wasn't just the food, though the critics had raved about the menu. It was the way everyone was treated, with the same dignity and respect that Mrs. Ann had shown James. The staff included 2 servers in wheelchairs, a host who was deaf, but could read lips beautifully, and several others who might have been overlooked elsewhere, but shone brightly here. The corner table, now known as Anne's Corner, had become a special spot for regular customers. Above it hung the photo of Mrs. Ann at her piano, her smile forever captured in black and white. The table itself was often reserved for those who seemed to need a little extra kindness. Elderly couples struggling with mobility, people dining alone, families with special needs children. James's mother, her arthritis now better managed thanks to the improved medical care they could afford, often sat at the kitchen counter, teaching the younger cooks her secret recipes. Her proud smile when customers praised the food lit up the whole kitchen. She'd tell anyone who would listen about how her son had turned his dream into reality while never forgetting his roots. The old diner regulars had all found their places here too. Mr. Johnson came every morning for his coffee, now served in a special cup with his name on it. Betty hosted a weekly lunch group for senior citizens, filling Anne's Corner with laughter and stories. Even some of the bank managers who had once rejected James's loan applications became regular customers, though they now had to wait for a table just like everyone else. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Anne's kitchen was its commitment to continuing Mrs. Anne's legacy of kindness. Every Tuesday and Thursday, just as she used to visit the diner, the restaurant offered pay what you can meals. People who couldn't afford a full meal could enjoy the same quality food and service as everyone else, their dignity intact. The walls had become a living gallery of community stories. Alongside Mrs. Anne's photo hung pictures of milestone moments. Wedding proposals at Anne's corner, graduation celebrations, reunion dinners. Each photo told a story of connection, of lives touched by the simple act of being treated with respect. On quiet evenings, James would sometimes sit at Anne's corner, reading through the guest book filled with messages of gratitude. "First time I've eaten out since my accident," one note read. "Felt like family here." Another, "Thank you for making my grandfather feel special on his 90th birthday." Each message reminded him of his own journey and the woman who had made it possible. One year to the day after opening, James stood in the kitchen, watching through the service window as his staff welcomed the morning's first customers. The sunlight caught the framed sheet music of Moonlight Sonata hanging in Anne's corner, making it glow like a beacon. In that moment, he could almost hear Mrs. Anne's voice. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact. He touched the small photo he kept in his pocket. Mrs. Anne's last day at the diner, her eyes twinkling with the secret she was about to share. Her gift had been more than money. It was the belief that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be treated with dignity. As he tied on his apron and prepared for another day of serving not just food but hope, James knew that Mrs. Anne's spirit lived on in every meal served, every smile shared, every person who walked through the doors feeling like a stranger and left feeling like family. In the end, that was the greatest legacy of all. Not just a successful restaurant, but a place where kindness and dignity had found a permanent home.